Hi everyone, and greetings from Yale, where it is indeed kind of snowy today. So welcome to this session on the secrets of the Congressional Record. I'm sure that many of you have used the Congressional Record before in one format or another, but I hope that today's presentation will give you some new insights and new strategies for making the most of this publication. So I'll begin by confessing that I hadn't actually given much thought to the Congressional Record until I received a very intriguing request from a patron. It seems that at some point in the 1980s, a member of Congress had inserted lyrics to the Cole Porter song, "Brush Up Your Shakespeare," into the Congressional Record because he said that every day should begin with poetry. So this patron needed assistance finding the exact date and the exact quotation from the representative. So I turned, as I often do, to ProQuest Congressional, performed my keyword, date, and source type search, and found the full text and marveled once again at the quirkiness of government information. But before that question crossed my desk, the Congressional Record was just another one of the seemingly infinite number of publications produced by the legislative branch. I'm glad that there are going to be more webinars on congressional information because there's just so much out there and it can be kind of difficult to know what information lives where. And we'll talk about that a bit more in this session as well. But when working with history students, I'd often emphasize the Congressional Record as a primary source material. With political science students, I'd emphasize the record as a daily account of what happens in Congress. But it really took digging in and exploring the Congressional Record to get a better sense of what it is, what types of questions it answers and raises, and how I might make more effective use of it with researchers. I hope that this session provides all of you with a similar experience. So in this session, we're going to start with the most obvious question. What is the Congressional Record? Next, we'll uncover the history of the record and its predecessors. We'll explore how the Congressional Record differs from other congressional documents and how it might complement some of those publications as well. And then finally, we'll get to the other obvious question, which is, where is it and how do we actually use it? Let's begin with the basics. What is the Congressional Record? Quite simply, it's the official record of the proceedings and debates of the U.S. Congress, and it's been published since 1873. It began with the 43rd Congress. When thinking about what's in the Congressional Record and what isn't included, here's some kind of basic guidelines for what you'll find and what you won't find. First of all, you'll find the daily business of Congress. This includes when the proceedings were called to order, the morning prayers, and even kind of a running timestamp of what happened at what time. You'll also see the introduction of bills, which appears in kind of a list form, as we'll see later, with notes on which committee the bill was referred to. You'll find the text of bills as passed by one of the chambers, roll call votes, and then this is where it starts to get, I think, very interesting. So you'll find commentary from representatives and senators on pending legislation, policy issues, a variety of domestic and global affairs, and this is where the debates part of the Congressional Record really comes in. This is where everyone gets to get on their soapbox for a few minutes and talk about the issues that are important to them. Along those lines, you'll also see that there are a lot of remarks and letters and petitions from constituents. So if you want to get a sense of what the people think about various topics, the Congressional Record is a good place to go for that sort of information as well, because representatives and senators will read the letters and remarks that they receive from their people back home. You'll also find a lot of very quirky information like, you know, praise for the local Little League team that won its championship. So there's a lot of it's a mix of global and very, very local all in one publication. So that's what's in the Congressional Record. Things that aren't in the Congressional Record are basically congressional documents that are published elsewhere. So things like the full text of hearings, committee reports or committee prints, if they've been published separately, you're not going to find them in the Congressional Record. You also won't find the text of bills as introduced, reported, or enrolled. So it's not one-stop shopping for everything you might possibly need from Congress, but it's a very good place to go to get a daily account of what's happening, along with a lot of really interesting kind of debate and back and forth. So how is it organized and why are there multiple editions? This is one of the, I think, most confusing parts for me to figure out why there had to be a daily edition and a bound edition and what the difference was between them and how it was organized. So just a kind of quick overview of the organization of the Congressional Record as it's currently published. There are 4 sections. One section devoted to the proceedings of the House, one to the proceedings of the Senate, a section called the Extension of Remarks, which includes additional materials that are inserted into the public record. And finally, there's the Daily Digest, which is a section that began in 1947 with the 80th Congress as a summary of House and Senate chamber and committee actions. So this includes the schedule of when committee meetings are happening, when hearings are occurring, and you can look to this as a way to figure out what happened when. So the Daily Digest appears in the daily edition of the Congressional Record, and it also is published in the bound edition of the Congressional Record as the final part of each session volume. So the daily and bound editions, there actually used to be a 3rd edition as well. There was a biweekly edition that was around for a few decades and was discontinued in 1985. But the important part to know is that there's now the daily edition, which is printed the following morning and separately paginated. So each of the 4 sections have their own pagination. And then there's the bound or permanent edition that has continuous pagination. There's time for the text to be edited and revised, and there can be a significant lag between the daily and bound editions, a lag of sometimes upwards of 5 years. So something to keep in mind is that the most recent edition that you're going to see will always be the daily edition. You'll be able to find this fairly easily through FDSIS, through congress.gov, and through some other access points we'll see later. But if you're looking for last year's bound Congressional Record, you're not going to find it yet. So in addition to the basic organization of each edition, there's also a Congressional Record Index that serves as the index of the Congressional Record, and it's printed bi-weekly, and it includes an index as well as the history of bills and resolutions, and you can get to these documents on FDSIS as well. So this is a good place to go to find the names of members of Congress, to find subject terms, and as I said, you can see this in FDSIS back to 1983. It's also important to note that the Congressional Record is what, as they say, substantially verbatim. So the authority for the Congressional Record comes from Title 44 of the U.S. Code, and it establishes the Congressional Record as substantially a verbatim report of proceedings, but there's still, even within this, a concern for the reduction of unnecessary bulk. The intention here is to provide an accurate transcription of congressional proceedings, but in a somewhat pared down, standardized format. So an example of what this looks like is on a page in which bills and joint resolutions are introduced. So we get some basic language saying that public bills and resolutions were introduced and referred to particular committees, followed by a simple list of who introduced the bill, a very brief summary, and the committee to which it was referred. So this is an example of where they sort of edited a bit to get out some of that unnecessary bulk. It's also important to know that, so it's substantially verbatim, but non-substantive changes can be made by members of Congress twice. So they can make some edits before the daily edition is published, and then again before the bound edition is published. So there are some points at which edits can be made that shouldn't be significant, but you know, it's worth knowing about. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the Congressional Record only began in 1873. So what happened before that? And there are a number of congressional publications that were around before the Congressional Record. The House and Senate journals were actually established by Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution as a way to record legislative minutes, including votes and bill histories. So the House and Senate journals and the Journal of Executive Proceedings of the U.S. Senate, which records Senate action on nominations and treaties, those have all been published since 1789, but there was no provision in place for transcripts or summaries of debates. So there were actually 3 predecessors of the Congressional Record, but these are all kind of colored by just the fact that there was really no mandate for any sort of recording for the debates. There are also some issues with the presence or sometimes absence of reporters allowed in the House and Senate. So the House actually always allowed the press, but the Senate took until about 1795, and even then it was kind of debated whether or not there should be reporters allowed in the chamber. But these are the predecessors of the Congressional Record. They were all produced by commercial publishers, and for the most part, so as I said, the Congressional Record now is substantially verbatim, but for the most part, these predecessors were not. They were compiled from newspaper accounts and really edited according to the interests, politics, and how much column space was available to the publishers. So the first one is the Annals of Congress. The actual official title is the Debates and Proceedings in the Congress of the United States. And even though this is first in terms of which Congresses it covers, beginning with the first Congress, it was not published contemporaneously with the debates that were happening. It takes to the second set of volumes, the Register of Debates in Congress. That's when it was actually published contemporaneously. So let's take a look first at the Annals of Congress. So this covers the first Congress through the 18th Congress first session, which is 1789 to 1824. And it was compiled between 1834 and 1856 by the publishers Gales and Seton. And they mostly used newspaper accounts. And it's interesting to note that Gales and Seton were at the same time publishing some newspapers themselves, including the National Intelligencer. So these were commercial publishers. They were reporting on Congress, and then they went back to their own newspapers to actually compile these volumes. And they don't, I should also mention that it's not like they're going in and citing each source very diligently. If you go back and look at the Annals of Congress, it really does just kind of read like someone was there reporting on this, and we're giving you the highlights of what was happening. Gales and Seton also allowed members of Congress to edit their remarks. So not even before going into the Annals of Congress, but even before those remarks were published in the National Intelligencer, members of Congress were allowed to make edits if they wanted to go back in and say, oh, wow, I really shouldn't have said that, or make this sound a little bit fancier. And Gales and Seton would dutifully edit those remarks as needed. So, as I said, this is not verbatim, and at the same time, you could go back and you could look at the House and Senate journals from this time if you wanted to see kind of more information about what was going on in Congress. But really it is in the Annals that you'll get a fuller picture of the debates that are happening. The journal is, as we'll see a bit later, there's not a whole lot of descriptive information going on in there. So the Annals of Congress is still a good place to turn to for the debates. So after the Annals, you'll find the Register of Debates. So this began with the 18th Congress second session, so it picks up right where the Annals left off. And it goes through the 25th Congress first session, so that's 1824 to 1837. And as I said earlier, this was the first set that was published contemporaneously with the proceedings. Also published by Gales and Seton, who used their experience with the Register of Debates as they were working on compiling the Annals. So there are some appendices that include presidential messages and the text of laws. Once again, it's not verbatim, but it's a summary of what they call the leading debates and incidents. So there's actually, toward the end of this presentation, I have put together a slide with some recommendations for further reading, and there is a page from the Senate. It's a Senate history page about the Congressional Record. It's very fascinating. It gets into a lot of the kind of politics of the record and its predecessors. And one of the things that I took away from that page was that Gales and Seton were Whigs, and they fell out of favor when Andrew Jackson and the Democrats came in, which explains why they sort of end in 1837, while the next set of debate volumes, the Congressional Globe, comes in, and the Whigs didn't like the Globe, and there's just a lot of kind of battling back and forth between the publications until eventually the next volume, the Congressional Globe, won out. So this picked up in the 23rd Congress, and it went through the 42nd Congress, so 1833 to 1873. The Congressional Globe started as a condensed report, but became almost verbatim with the 32nd Congress in 1851. And that's because there were improvements to shorthand methods, and there were new stenographic reporters who were allowed on the floor, and there was a shift from the recounting of debates as from third-person summaries to first-person narratives. So the Globe also became, at one point, the semi-official publication of the Senate in 1846, quickly followed by similar status in the House in 1850. So as it became more official, the push toward making it verbatim, of course, also kind of grew. So all three of the predecessors of the Congressional Record are available through American Memory. They're also available through subscription sources like ProQuest Congressional and Hein Online. So I'm going to focus today on what's available for free without the subscription databases, just in case there are those of you who don't subscribe to these resources. So American Memory has the Century of Lawmaking for a New Nation collection, and that includes the House and Senate journals, as well as what the section they're calling the Debates of Congress, which includes the Annals, the Register, the Congressional Globe, and then a few early volumes of the Congressional Record. So just to take a look at how you might explore some of these resources, here's the page for the Annals of Congress, 1789 to 1824. And as you can see, you can browse by date or volume. There's also the option to search. But what this is searching is the index to the annals, not the full text. And similarly for the other series, the Register of Debates and the Congressional Globe, what you're searching are the indexes to those volumes, not the full text. But this is what some of the index entries look like. So if you're interested in looking at the annals and you're curious about the original debates around the census, you could follow the link to Census House of Representatives or Census Bill House of Representatives and go to the sections of the annals that cover materials related to the census. There are also some interesting areas here. So if you're interested in challenges, duels, or challenging a member of the House of Representatives, there's a lot of really good stuff in this index, worth checking out. So this is the list of results for looking at materials related to the census in the annals. And you can see a bit of information about from the first Congress, second session related to the census bill, and then later volumes that are talking about the administration of later censuses. So as I said, all of the predecessors of the Congressional Record are available through American Memory. And now we can take a look at the actual Congressional Record itself. So the Congressional Globe was mostly verbatim, but there were some issues with the lag time in printing during the Civil War and Reconstruction, which led to a bit of a shakeup. And it became clear that there needed to be a faster and cheaper way to print the debates of Congress. So in 1871, Congress passed an act charging the congressional printer with printing the debates, which then transferred over to GPO in 1873. And this is how we ended up with the Congressional Record as we have it today, or as we have it in one of the most recent editions. This is from December 2nd. So here are just some highlights that I found as I was flipping through to give you a sense of some of the types of remarks and commentary that you'll find. So things related to Obamacare, immigration, and the disturbing agreement with Iran. As I said at the beginning, it can be kind of difficult to know where to begin with congressional research because there are so many different congressional publications, and it's hard to know what type of information ends up where. So I wanted to just kind of walk through an example going from a bill to a hearing to the Congressional Record and the journals to see how you might help researchers if they're doing this sort of research and what types of things you'll find in a Congressional Record versus what you'll find elsewhere. So I'm going to begin with a Senate bill that was introduced on May 26, 1930, which was legislation to amend the Tariff Act of 1922 and the Criminal Code, which prohibited the mailing of birth control, contraceptive devices, and any informational literature about those devices. We can see how it's reported in both the Senate Journal and the Congressional Record. And it's actually identical. The reporting of the introduction of the bill is the same word for word. Here's the bill, here's what it's amending, and it's been referred to the Committee on the Judiciary. So after this, I found out that there was a hearing. It was introduced in May of 1930, and then in February of 1931, there was a hearing on the bill. And the text of the hearing, I was able to read that in full text from ProQuest Congressional. We have it in print in our collections. Many of you might have it on print or microfilm. And we can see the full text of the hearing with testimony from Margaret Sanger, representatives from the American Eugenics Society, speakers from the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, the types of testimony you'd expect to find in a bill related to birth control in the 1930s. So the text of the hearing is not included in the Congressional Record. It's not included in the Journal. But I can go to both the Senate Journal and the Congressional Record to see what else was going on, what was being said in Congress around the time of the hearing. So the Senate Journal from February of 1931 tells us that there were memorials against the enactment of Senate Bill 4582 relative to birth control. And there are lists of which statements were read and by whom and who was giving these memorials, but that's it. It's just a list of Mr. Robinson of Indiana passed along some information from the Irvington Catholic Women's Study Club. In the Congressional Record, we actually get a lot of additional information, including the text of the letters that was sent in by groups like the Irvington Catholic Women's Study Club. So in here, let me just go back to my notes. So Mr. Robinson of Indiana, Mr. President, I have received letters from Mrs. R. Babcock, et cetera, et cetera. My constituents in their communications ask that their protest be written into the Congressional Record. I therefore ask unanimous consent that these letters in full be incorporated in the record and appropriately referred. So these letters are printed and then referred on to the Committee on the Judiciary. And when we start to read these letters, we can get a sense of who was protesting the pending legislation and why. So the Irvington Catholic Women's Study Club feel that the passage of this bill would be very dangerous to public health and morals and would vitally affect the standards of right and public morality of our young people. And there are additional letters here as well. So this is one way that the Congressional Record gives a fuller picture of what's being said in Congress, also a fuller picture of public opinion. So that might be one reason to turn to the Congressional Record, even if you found the full text of a hearing where you get testimony from important people like Margaret Sanger, but then you can also get some public opinion from local groups and individuals as well. Another important question about the Congressional Record, where is it? How do you find it? There are actually lots of different access points for the Congressional Record. So I've included some of the main ones here. I included both congress.gov and Thomas, which is, I realized very recently that as of mid-November, they've started pushing the redirect to congress.gov. So we all knew it was happening, but apparently it happened a few weeks ago. You can still get to the Thomas site from congress.gov. There's a little link in the upper right-hand corner, I think. So if you're a big fan of Thomas and not ready to make the switch to congress.gov, it looks like you can still do that for now, although how long that will last, I don't actually know. But there are lots of different access points, but there are lots of caveats for these different access points. So ProQuest Congressional and Hein Online are fantastic because they have such extensive coverage, great for historical coverage going all the way back to the annals. They're very easy to search. They have great indexing, but of course they're not free. There are other resources that are free but have more scattered coverage. So the Internet Archive, HathiTrust, you'll find some volumes through Google Books. They're very easy to search, they're free, but you're only going to find bits and pieces. And if you're doing a more systematic search, you're probably going to want to see a greater range of years. There's also FDSIS from GPO, which is, of course, free. It has coverage back to 1994, which is, you know, slightly historical, maybe not the best when you're working with history students who need to go further back, but it's good for at least for current coverage. But I personally find that it's not the most user-friendly search. It can be a little difficult to figure out how to actually get into the Congressional Record. You can browse by date, but it can be a little fussy sometimes. But I do want to actually get into some live searches just to show you what this looks like in congress.gov and FDSIS. So this is congress.gov, and as I mentioned, you can go to the upper right-hand corner to get to Thomas if you're still interested in going there. But from congress.gov, you can get to the daily edition of the Congressional Record going back to 1995. So Thomas actually had fuller coverage back to 1989, but the intention is that Congress.gov will eventually catch up to or go back to the coverage that was in Thomas. So there's a section for the Congressional Record sort of toward the middle of the page. You'll see that there is an app for the iPhone or the iPad if you want to take the Congressional Record on the go. And then there's also the option up here for Congressional Record. So you can search by keyword, of course. You can also see the latest edition or browse by date. So if we go into browse by date, and you can see at a glance that recently there haven't been sections from the Senate because the Senate hasn't been in session. But if you wanted to skip to, let's say, what was going on in August, you can get to the volume here. So there's the entire issue, or it's broken out, as I mentioned earlier, by these different sections. So if you just are interested in what was happening in the Senate, or if you want to go into the Daily Digest and get the sort of highlights of what was happening, which committees were meeting, you can go into the Daily Digest here. So I'm just going to do a keyword search in the Congressional Record to show you a bit of what this looks like. I'm going to search for Joey Ramone. Joey Ramone of the punk band The Ramones. This seems like a reasonable search. And the first thing that comes up is actually a tribute to the late Joey Ramone. So this is something that you'll see in the Congressional Record. There will be tributes to notable people, and this actually shows up in the extension of remarks. I'll click on this just to show you that Anthony Weiner was the one who wanted to recognize one of his constituents, the late Joey Ramone. And this is in the extension of remarks, and you'll find some, it's actually the New York Times article that summarizes the life of Joey Ramone. So you can use kind of more, more traditional keywords here. So I'm going to search for Obamacare just to see where this is coming up in the Congressional Record. Oh. So I can go in and search by Congress. I will see that there are over 1,000 references to Obamacare in the current Congress, and that it looks like most of those references are coming from the House of Representatives, which kind of makes sense. So here's one on Do Not Repeal Obamacare. And then we can get either text or PDF of this page. So this is the Congressional Record from congress.gov. As I mentioned, you can also get to it from FDSIS. So, and at the end of the slides, I've included links to the major access points. So FDSIS has coverage back to 1994, so of the daily edition, and it also has the bound edition 1999 to 2001. So again, it's there's a bit of a lag. It's not complete coverage, but it's a good place to start. So you can either go in to click on the Congressional Record under Browse, and this is a way to get to the most recent issue if you wanted to search by date. Okay, here we go. All right, so you can browse by date, but you can also go back and search by keyword. And if you wanted to do an advanced search here in FDSIS, you'll see that there are a few options. So Congressional Record bound, so it just has those few years of the bound volumes, and then the Congressional Record Index. So if you wanted to see what index terms were used for a particular term, particular person, you can do that in FDsys. So let's search the Congressional Record, we'll say add here, and then we'll search in full text for Obamacare. It does actually turn up, and you don't necessarily have to go in to limit your search to the Congressional Record. You can obviously just do a general basic search in FDsys and then narrow your search using the facets on the left and get into the Congressional Record there. But if you know that you're looking for the Congressional Record, it can be very helpful to just go there directly. And once again, you'll get to the PDF. So one nice thing about this search is that we saw that there were facets in congress.gov, but it was kind of limited to House or Senate. It was limited to Congress. But here we actually get a bit more. So we get the date of publication, but also we get people in Congress too. And that can be very useful if you're looking for who said what. There's also this section on associated legislation. So this can be good if you're looking for kind of popular names of legislation and you want to actually go back to information that pertains to that legislation. You can use the facets here. That is Congress.gov and FDsys. Okay, oh, and so I see there's a question here about interested in the facet for organization. And so what counts as an organization in FDsys? And I'm actually looking at it right now, although I don't have it up on the other screen, but it includes things like different committees. So if you are interested in, you're doing a search for Obamacare and you're interested in specifically the Committee on Appropriations, that's where you can go in and narrow it down by organization there, and you'll see that there are 128 results from the Committee on Appropriations. There are also some other kind of companies, some other entities, so other things that come up are different insurance companies, organizations like Amtrak or Bloomberg, so, or even Google. So the organization function it's apparently looking very broadly at both committees and groups within Congress, but then also outside entities as well. So there are some other ways to take a look at the Congressional Record. I wanted to show some kind of interesting tools that you can use to explore the Congressional Record in greater depth. Some of you might be familiar with these. There are two that I wanted to focus on, both from the Sunlight Foundation, which is an organization that promotes transparency in government. They have a lot of really interesting tools for kind of using and exploring government data, and specifically open data, of which the Congressional Record is part. So they're using the Congressional Record along with the text of bills and other congressional materials to create really user-friendly interfaces that allow citizens to explore government. So this is Scout. It's at scout.sunlightfoundation.com. And you can use this and you can search by keyword, you can search by bill number, and if you look over on the left side, you'll see that there are some filters here. So the option for speeches in Congress is what is searching the Congressional Record. Once I'm into the Congressional Record, I can see who's talking about Obamacare. I can also limit it further by state or by party. And it's a really nice way to, you can definitely find references to Obamacare in the FDsys version and the Congress.gov version of the Congressional Record. But here you can actually create alerts. So if you wanted to get an alert every time Obamacare is mentioned as a term in the Congressional Record, you can set up an account with Scout and actually generate alerts so that you don't need to read the Congressional Record every day, but you still know what's happening. Related to Scout is another tool from the Sunlight Foundation called Capital Words. And this is nice because you can search by individual keyword, but you can also do these comparisons. I'm not sure if you can actually see what is being compared here, but it's looking at the terms global warming and climate change and comparing both how often it's been said over time, that there are certain spikes on along the graph, but then also who's saying it. So are Democrats more likely to say global warming or climate change, or Republicans more likely to say one or the other? You can get this information that's just being pulled from the congressional record. So if I'm interested in seeing, for example, who is actually using the term Obamacare, and if my hunch is that it might be favored by one party instead of another, or it might be more popular from in certain states or among certain representatives or senators, I can use capital words to actually tease that out. So I get the occurrences over time. I can see that it only started not that long ago, which makes sense. I can see over on the right popularity by party, and that for the most part it's Republicans who are using the term Obamacare. And then I can also see who's mentioning it most often. So this was just a very basic search, but it can be a fun way to show students and researchers kind of how language is used in Congress, and how the congressional record is a way to actually get into the terms of different debates, and kind of who's saying what and when, and how is that being used. So that is Capital Words, and that is capitalwords.org. And this is just an overview of those online access points. So one thing that I haven't really mentioned that I would like to say is that sometimes it can actually be very helpful to go to the print congressional record. This is something that I had a lot of success with some students who had never used the congressional record. They were working with faculty members who said, I need you to go into the congressional record and find every instance of, you know, a certain every time a certain organization is mentioned in the congressional record. So the students who were working on this kind of project had never used the congressional record, didn't know how it was organized or what they might find there. So it was actually very helpful to sit them down with print, and I understand that not every student will want to sit down with these old print volumes, but it was very helpful for them to see that there was an index, to see the types of things that came up as index terms. And then they did end up using the ProQuest Congressional full text search, but they were able to take their knowledge of what the congressional record was and how it was organized and make more informed keyword and index searches in ProQuest Congressional. So as I said, this is just a sort of quick overview of where you can find the congressional record online. So FDSIS does have the daily edition, 1994 to present. Congress.gov and Thomas have 1995 and 1989 to present respectively, the daily edition. You'll find scattered volumes that have been digitized, and then full text, very extensive coverage through subscription databases like ProQuest Congressional and Hein Online. Finally, there's also the iPad and iPhone app, and Scout and Capital Words. And here, as promised, are some suggestions for further reading. So there were some great articles and online publications that were very helpful to me as I was learning a bit more about the congressional record. So those are live links that will take you to the documents, with the exception of the final article, which is published in 1942 and is a very readable and lively account of reporting the debates of Congress. So now we have lots of time for questions and time for a picture of me with FDR.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for doing this. This is very good.